If our independence means nothing, then we will burn what binds us. We will not negotiate slavery. We will not decorate our chains. We will break them.
Those were not empty words. They were a warning, a line drawn in blood and belief. And now the prophecy has come true, not in Ouagadougou, not in Bamako, not in Niamey, but in Paris. France is collapsing economically, politically, spiritually, not because of bombs or boycotts, but because three young African nations finally stood up and said, no more. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, no longer waiting, no longer begging, no longer asking the colonizer for permission to breathe. France's debt now spirals out of control, $5,000 per second. The Prime Minister stands before his people and admits, we cannot pay. Not our pensions, not our salaries, not even the basic needs of our citizens. But that's not the story they want you to hear. They want you to believe Africa is the one in crisis, that Burkina Faso is unstable, that Mali is dangerous, that Niger is ungrateful. Yet it is Paris, the proud capital of the so-called free world, that now begs for relief while the streets of Ouagadougou build their own future in silence. Because the most dangerous revolution is not loud, it's disciplined, it's deliberate, it's African. Three leaders, three different nations, one united decision: cut the cord, burn the chains, take back the gold. This is not just economic warfare, this is spiritual warfare. It's not about uranium or CFA francs, it's about who owns the right to decide Africa's future. And this time, Africa is choosing itself. If you're part of the diaspora, Atlanta, Baltimore, London, don't scroll past this moment. This is the turning of an era, and we must bear witness. Subscribe to Spirit of Africa, because we don't report headlines, we report reversals of history. In January 2024, French Prime Minister François Bayrou stood before the nation and dropped a truth no one expected to hear: we no longer have the money. Not for pensions, not for subsidies, not even to sustain our state. France, once the proud ruler of African colonies, now pleads for financial relief. A 154 billion budget hole, spiraling debt, cuts to public services. But here's what they won't say. This collapse didn't begin in Paris. It began when Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger refused to pay the empire's bills. For decades, France lived off Africa's gold, uranium, and reserves. Now those pipelines have been severed, and as France trembles under its own weight, a new fire is rising across the Sahel, led by a man who didn't need bullets to defeat colonialism. Just courage. Let us now follow that fire. To where it all began, Ouagadougou, Traore, and the day he broke the chain. When a soldier breaks rank, it's called disobedience. When a president does it, they call it treason. But what do you call it when a captain, young, unarmed, underestimated, breaks from the entire post-colonial system? You call it liberation. And that's exactly what happened in Burkina Faso. It didn't start with a gunshot. It started with a decision: we will not vote in a system built to deceive. In March 2025, Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and made a declaration that sent shockwaves across the continent. The Western voting system is not democracy. It is a performance, a ritual, an illusion. We will not waste one more coin pretending it serves us. He shut it down. No ballot boxes, no campaigns, no billion-dollar budgets for empty promises. He called it a waste of money, time, and dignity. And suddenly, Burkina Faso became the first African nation to abolish the colonial-style electoral system entirely. Was it madness, or was it finally honesty? Because let's tell the truth, how many elections in Africa have ever brought true independence? How many times have the people voted and still been handed the same IMF deals, the same French envoys, the same puppet presidents in designer suits? Ask Kenya, ask Congo, ask Senegal. They voted, and still they bled. But Traoré, he didn't want to be a president chosen by ballots printed in Europe. He wanted to be a servant chosen by sacrifice. So instead of investing in campaigns, he invested in tractors. Instead of polling stations, he built silos. Instead of paying election observers from the EU, he paid local engineers to electrify villages. They mocked him. Western diplomats dismissed it as authoritarian drift. Foreign journalists called him dangerous, irrational, even anti-democratic. But what they couldn't answer was simple: if your democracy needs millions in foreign aid to function, is it really yours? Traoré didn't destroy democracy. He reclaimed it. He replaced hollow elections with direct local councils, trained citizens in law and ethics, and reallocated voting funds to food sovereignty, education, and defense. Democracy is not a ceremony. Every 5 years, he said, it is how we eat, how we protect, and how we build every day. And the people, they didn't protest, they celebrated, because for the first time in generations, they weren't being sold the fantasy of choice, they were being handed real power in their villages, their farms, their lives. The West panicked, the EU froze development funds. ECOWAS issued vague threats, think tanks cried dictatorship, but none of it worked. Why? Because Traore wasn't playing their game anymore. He had flipped the table and walked away. And that's the part that truly terrifies them. Not that Traore is young, not that he's radical, but that he is effective. He exposed the truth that Western-backed elections often exist to give global powers a veneer of legitimacy in countries they still exploit. And now others are watching. Guinea has paused electoral timelines. Mali has declared traditional councils supreme. Niger has banned foreign electoral monitors. What Traore lit in Ouagadougou is no longer a spark, it is a wildfire. And in Paris, in Brussels, in Washington, they're scrambling. Because the myth is collapsing. The myth that says Africa is free because it votes. No. Africa is free when it feeds itself, arms itself, and thinks for itself. And Traore, he did not ask for permission. He just acted. So now the question echoes across the continent. If Burkina Faso can break the system, what's stopping the rest of us? They told us voting was sacred, that democracy was priceless, that elections were the ultimate expression of freedom. But they never told us the price tag, because behind every election in Africa, sponsored by the West, there's a bill. And behind every bill, there's a beneficiary, and it's almost never the people. Let's follow the money. In 2020 alone, the European Union spent over $500 million on election-related activities in Africa. That includes voter education, electoral logistics, observer missions, technical support, and ironically, democracy strengthening. But who got that money? Let's be honest, it wasn't the local teachers training new voters. It wasn't the farmers learning about their rights. It wasn't the mothers in the villages praying for safe polling. It was NGOs based in Paris, consultants flown in from Brussels, security teams from Geneva, and media specialists from Washington, D.C. They arrived in suits, stayed in hotels, wrote long reports, and left. Democracy became a business model, not a belief, not a contract, a revenue stream. And every time Africa votes, they get paid. Who prints the ballot papers? Western firms. Who ships the ballot boxes? European logistics companies. Who counts the votes? Independent observers trained in Harvard, funded by London, backed by USAID. And when there's tension, they call for post-election dialogue, another $1 million process that ends with more meetings, more flights, and more dollars drained from Africa's pockets. But no clean water, no power in rural clinics, no fertilizer subsidies, just votes, just rituals. Just debt. Now let's talk about the aid packages. After every successful election, countries like Burkina Faso receive new lines of credit, not grants loans from institutions like the IMF and World Bank. They frame it as support for democratic consolidation. But buried in the fine print, structural adjustment conditions, privatize healthcare, deregulate fuel, cut public sector jobs, and always honor your debt repayments. So, what's really being bought here? Not democracy. Control. Let's look at Kenya. In 2022, the general election cost nearly $370 million, one of the most expensive in African history. And yet what followed? Violence, protests, allegations of fraud. A government now crippled by debt, pushing tax hikes, selling national assets, and deploying the military against its own people. Is that democracy? Or is that a well-branded trap? Because in the end, it's never about the vote. It's about what the vote enables, the illusion of legitimacy for regimes that continue old colonial contracts. And in Burkina Faso, Traore saw through it. He asked the unthinkable, what if we stopped paying for this performance? What if we used that money to build grain banks instead of ballot boxes? What if we trained engineers instead of polling agents? What if we trusted our elders and community leaders more than consultants flown in with translators? And what if just maybe we governed ourselves without foreign referees? The reaction was immediate. Western media called it anti-democratic. Human rights organizations panicked. Think tanks scrambled to issue policy memos. Why? Because the withdrawal of funding didn't just threaten the process, it threatened the industry. And it forced a question that many weren't ready to answer. If democracy cannot survive without donor money, is it democracy or is it dependency? Meanwhile, the people of Burkina Faso didn't miss the vote. Instead, they harvested cassava, they built roads, they organized local security patrols. They held town forums where real grievances were heard not on TV but under trees face to face. And isn't that democracy? Not the spectacle, not the slogans, but the substance. So now, as the West continues to lecture Africa on governance, Traoré's Burkina Faso quietly redefines what that word means, not by voting every 5 years, but by building every day. And as this new model spreads from Niamey to Bamako to Freetown, those who once profited from Africa's ballots are growing desperate. Because if Africa stops buying the lie, the whole business collapses. They say the vote is sacred, that every citizen holds power, that the ballot box is the great equalizer between rich and poor, educated and illiterate city and village. But if that were true, why does democracy cost so much? And why do the poorest always pay the highest price? Let's speak plainly. Voting is no longer a right. In many parts of Africa, it has become a luxury. To register, you need ID. To get ID, you need documents. To get documents, you need money. To travel to the office that issues them, you need more money. If you're in a rural village in northern Burkina Faso or the highlands of Kenya, how do you get to the nearest polling station? Some walk 20 kilometers. Others wait in lines for 10 hours under the sun. And for what? To cast a vote, they didn't design for candidates. They didn't choose on platforms. They don't understand in languages they don't speak. This isn't inclusion. This is a performance. Because while the poor wait in the heat with their fingers inked, the elite are making deals in air-conditioned boardrooms. They already know the outcome. And here's the hardest truth of all. Those who win elections don't need the people. They need donors. Presidential campaigns in many African nations now cost tens of millions of dollars. Where does that money come from? International backers, billionaire friends, offshore accounts, foreign embassies eager to support democratic stability. And once the candidate wins, who do they serve? Do they answer to the farmer who stood in line with a torn sandal or the French oil executive who financed his jet? We know the answer. That's why Traoré rejected it. He saw that for the poor, voting changes nothing, but for the powerful it changes everything because it grants them legitimacy. Let's not forget, every dictator in Africa in the last 30 years won at least one free and fair election. Mubarak, Biya, Museveni, Bongo, and yes, even Ruto. They wore suits, held debates, kissed babies, raised flags, and then robbed their nations dry. Democracy didn't stop them. In fact, it protected them. Because once you win the vote, every critic becomes anti-democratic. Every protest becomes destabilizing. Every journalist becomes a threat to the process. But Traoré flipped the table. He asked, what if we didn't hand out legitimacy like candy every 5 years? What if we earned it every day through work, through sacrifice, through integrity? He refused to be a winner. He chose to be a builder, and it showed. Instead of buying airtime on TV, he distributed farming equipment. Instead of holding rallies, he visited flooded villages and organized sandbag defenses. Instead of printing campaign posters, he built youth training centers. And the people, they didn't chant his name. They picked up tools and joined him. Because they finally understood voting is not power, doing is power. Ask the youth in Kenya who are burning tires in the streets, not ballots. Ask the young mothers in Niger who are forming neighborhood food collectives. Ask the soldiers in Mali who now answer to village elders, not foreign-trained generals. They are not protesting against the absence of elections. They are rising against the illusion of elections that change nothing. And what did the West do in response? They issued warnings, they cut aid, they called for restoration of constitutional order, but no one stopped to ask constitutional for whom, order for what. Because if the system preserves the comfort of the elite and the suffering of the poor, then what exactly are we restoring? Traoré offered an answer. We will not build our country on borrowed language and borrowed dreams. We will build it on our own truth, even if it costs us comfort. And it is costing. It's costing him Western support. It's costing Burkina Faso trade deals. It's costing the government favorable headlines. But it's also gaining them something no election could ever deliver: respect. Not from the West, from their own people. And that is the most dangerous threat to the old order. Because a population that respects its leadership without being bribed or misled, that's a population that cannot be controlled. So now the world watches. Not because of what Burkina Faso voted for, but because of what it dared to walk away from. And that is the new luxury: not voting, but choosing not to be fooled. They told us democracy meant justice. But what happens when justice is the first thing that burns? Not the courtrooms, not the paperwork, but the very idea that power should serve the people. Across Africa, young men rot in prison for tweets. Journalists vanish for reporting truth. Elders are beaten for demanding food instead of slogans. And in the name of what democracy, Traore looked at the system and saw the lie. Justice wasn't blind. It was bought. It was managed. It was calibrated to protect the status quo. How many judges rule in favor of corporations that fund their salaries? How many police officers arrest protesters while saluting corrupt ministers? How many election commissions verify votes they never counted? The fire didn't start in the streets. It started in silence, in courtrooms, where injustice was rubber-stamped, in parliaments, where decisions were made behind glass walls, in offices where IMF envoys smiled while budgets for education were cut. This is what Traore burned down, not the buildings, the illusion. He said no to systems that punish the poor and protect the powerful. He said no to foreign-trained experts dictating the value of African lives. He said no to justice that waits 5 years for a ballot box but never comes when a village cries for clean water. And in saying no, he did something dangerous. He made people believe they deserved better. So now they gather, in farms, in schools, in circles under trees. They ask, what is justice and who stole it from us? And the world trembles, not because Burkina Faso left the old system, but because it lit a torch others might carry next. This is no longer about one man. It's not about Traore. It's not even about Burkina Faso. It's about us, all of us, because a question has been placed in the heart of Africa and it will not go away. Do we choose the comfort of the known lie or the hardship of a new truth? For decades, we've voted while starving. We've protested while begging. We've obeyed while being ignored. And they told us this was democracy. They told us to wait, to trust the process, to be patient, polite, and passive. But Traore ripped the mask off. He reminded us that no foreign framework will save us, no ballot funded by Brussels, no observer mission flown in from Washington, no summit in Paris or press release from New York. Only us, only people who dare to rebuild, not re-elect. So now the fire spreads, from Ouagadougou to Nairobi, from Bamako to Soweto, from Harlem to Brixton, and every African on the continent or in the diaspora must answer this. Will you be part of the generation that broke the spell, or part of the crowd that clapped for its own chains? There is no middle ground. Not anymore, because the machine that sold us fake freedom is stalling. And in its silence, something ancient is awakening: the African mind, the African will, the African courage to stand, to build, to defy. And that is why they fear Traore. Not because he shut down an election, but because he opened a door. So now we ask you, yes, you reading this, if democracy without dignity is no democracy at all, if freedom without bread is still slavery, if leaders must be builders, not performers, then what will you choose? Drop your voice in the comments. Stand with truth. Subscribe to Spirit of Africa and join the growing fire. Because this isn't the end, it's the beginning. And Africa is watching.